Professor Surajit Mazumdar, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Indian Association of Women's Studies for this invitation to be here today. In this interest of time, I shall get down to the topic of my presentation immediately. My entire kind of career as a teacher has more or less spanned the history of the period which has been talked about, the era of reforms. And when I look at what all one has seen in terms of policy initiatives over this last 25 years, and also what one has actually experienced on the ground, one might be forgiven for asking the question, is there a method in this madness, or is this the method of madness that one has witnessed over this last 2.5 decades? Because it's very hard actually to find any kind of a coherent vision having driven the process of so-called educational reforms over these last 2.5 decades. Even a coherent vision that one can challenge frontally, that this is the coherent vision, this is my problem with it. So I would suggest that perhaps it's better to look at what we have seen in terms of educational policy and educational reforms as reflecting the operation of a variety of different tendencies that have emerged from the trajectory of development we have had over the last 25 years. A variety of tendencies which partly can be eventually reinforcing, partly at times can work in different directions, and different tendencies may be more dominant in certain phases than others. And there's a certain dynamic, therefore, to that particular process where you don't necessarily see exactly the same thing at every stage of that particular process. So what are these kind of tendencies that one could identify which have been influencing the trajectory of Indian higher education in the last 25 years? One, of course, overarching reality which has been operative throughout has been, of course, the tendency towards fiscal compression. That is, this, one of the features of the neoliberal era is that governments are not supposed to tax heavily and not supposed to spend heavily, and therefore, throughout this period, in one form or the other, this thing of keeping the public expenditure on higher education within limits has been operative throughout this particular period. But this particular trend or tendency has also confronted the question of the demand for higher education. And I would like to look at the demand for higher education in two different ways. There is a demand for higher education that comes from the trajectory of private capital-led development in the era of globalization that we have seen here today. And that demand for higher education, I might venture to assert, is actually extremely limited. And limiting, not just limited, limiting. And that limitation comes from the fact that you essentially have a trajectory of development which relies on fitting into a subordinate position in a global economic and technological order, in which really what you require from the higher education system is some people who will enable you to be the back office of the world and the outsourcing destination of the world. It is not even a process of industrialization or technological innovation-based kind of growth where certain kinds of requirements have to be met by the higher education system. So it is an extremely limited and limiting demand that comes from this particular trajectory of development. On the other hand, and this is also a services-led growth pattern. On the other hand, you have also an increasing demand for education coming from your population. A reflection of that is what was referred to earlier, the massive expansion in enrollment in institutions of higher education in this country. Actually, the expansion has been extremely rapid in the last 2.5 decades. The enrollment ratio now is close to 24% of the 18 to 23 age group are studying in institutions of higher education. This expansion has, of course, meant also a widening of the social base of students who come into institutions of higher education. 46% of these students are women. So there's a great expansion of women students that has taken place in this particular period. Though scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, minorities representation is below their proportion in the population, nevertheless, it is not close to zero. It is still a fairly significant section of students come from these communities who are now in institutions of higher education. Of course, given the condition where the state was not willing to expand expenditure, bulk of this expansion has taken place in the private sector of Indian higher education. And bulk of its expansion has taken place in what you might call perhaps very poor quality higher education. Because if you have to have this expansion and rely on fees as the means on the basis of which you're going to run these institutions, then naturally, actually you have a very thin resource base. Whether you're talking about public or private higher education, it's a very thin resource base on which this education is supposedly provided. So you have this massive expansion that has taken place, largely through private. So more than 60% of the students now are studying in institutions of but there's also a privatization which is beyond that. It's not just a privatization of the institutions. There's also privatization in public institutions, that the proportion of expenditure that comes from the state and the proportion that people have to pay themselves, there has been a change. And I think it's hard to describe it in any, to find a specific way of capturing how this has happened, but you might say there has also been an high degree of privatization in the content of higher education that has happened over this period. So you have, therefore, it's difficult to describe the totality of this process as a process of democratization of Indian higher education, where you have on the one side this increasing privatization, on the other side an expanding base. But there is a tension or contradiction between these two trends that we are seeing. In addition, one has also seen that the ideological discourse surrounding education, the language in which education is talked about, particularly in policy-making circles, there is a clear shift that has taken place there also. Not that earlier rulers necessarily did what they talked about, but there was a certain language in which education was talked about, higher education was talked about, it being a means of self-reliance, it being the means of social transformation. From that, you have a shift to meeting global standards, becoming a knowledge superpower, the idea of educational institutions or universities being enterprises which have to be managed, which is just a euphemism for or rationalizing increasing authoritarian structures of governance of institutions. So you have this particular shift also taking place, which also influences the way in which actual policy making takes place. So I would like to see this particular process as one in which you have these two trends simultaneously taking place, one of which, the privatization of higher education in this country, being an essentially conservative force in that particular process, reinforcing all the structures of inequality that exist in our society. On the other hand, you have this expansion taking place of the number of students and a widening of the social base of students who come to institutions of higher education, and the tensions and contradictions that these give rise to express themselves in different ways, including in the unrest that one has seen in various institutions of higher education. Though perhaps till date, much of the unrest is concentrated in the public component of it and may not have expressed itself in the private component to a similar extent. These contradictions, of course, give rise to other kinds of contradictions which have to be, which are being confronted on a day-to-day basis. The question of language. What is the language in which, on the one side, there is a aspiration for English language education as the road to success. On the other side is the barrier that language itself places before many people. So there is the language question. There is the problem of regulation versus deregulation. You deregulate to allow private to grow, and then you have to regulate that private. So there are different ways in which this contradiction is actually expressing itself. But given this expansion and this transformation that has taken place in Indian higher education, perhaps in the larger agenda for transformation of Indian society, the development of the struggles around the contradictions that this particular process has given rise to may have assumed perhaps a greater importance than one has actually been able to fully comprehend till date. Thank you.